My daughter showed up at my door on a Friday morning and said, "Start packing, Mum. I've already sold your house. You're moving to a nursing home by Monday." I stood there, coffee cup in my hand, looking at the daughter I raised. And I said the only thing I could, "Come in, dear. You might want to see this." Have you ever felt like the invisible one in your own family while your sacrifices were completely remapped as corporate assets? Drop a comment, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I'd love to know who's part of our community. Anger wasn't loud this time, it was clinical. I didn't cry. I didn't ask her why she was treating her own flesh and blood like an outdated piece of commercial machinery. I had been the silent investor in her version of family for too long, and this wasn't a breakdown, it was an accounting. I calmly walked back into the light of my Savannah kitchen, carefully setting my ceramic coffee cup down onto the polished oak counter, with deliberate precision. The sudden, crisp sound of ceramic hitting wood echoed through the vast, quiet space of the estate, instantly freezing Brianna mid-sentence. She stood there in her clinical, hyper-tailored corporate suit, clutching a massive stack of asset liquidation papers, as if they were a weapon of absolute authority. My compassion had been a luxury she had overdrafted for years, but the line was officially cut. To understand why this retribution was completely deserved, you have to look at the balance sheet of this estate. 32 years ago, my late husband Marcus and I bought this colonial revival home for a modest $150,000. We poured every ounce of our physical labor and souls into clearing its debts long before the market matured it into a majestic $700,000 landmark. When Brianna demanded elite private tutoring and an advanced business degree, Marcus drove long-haul freight trucks on frozen weekend highways. I sat under flickering basement lights for hours, meticulously archiving ancient manuscripts. We didn't just fund her education. We financed her entire lifestyle, stepping back into the shadows so she could take center stage in the high-stakes financial circles of the city. We treated her as our pride, completely blind to the fact that we were funding a machine that would eventually turn on us. The downward spiral started the exact day she married Cody. Suddenly, our relationship became a corporate subscription, with me footing the bill while she completely withdrew. Her Sunday phone calls deteriorated into cold, transactional texts. Her holiday visits became performative public appearances where she stared at her phone instead of looking at her mother. The last time we had dinner together, her eyes weren't tracking memories. They were doing math. She looked at the crown moldings, the historical hardwood floors, and the sprawling gardens, and asked if I had ever thought about downsizing. That was the moment I realized the daughter I raised was entirely gone. She wasn't seeing her mother anymore. She was looking at an unliquidated commercial asset line to maintain her fragile social standing. But inside my mind, a different kind of sunrise was glowing, the kind made of facts, numbers, and quiet retribution. I adjusted my posture with quiet dignity, completely matching her coldness, and guided her toward the closed doors of the Western Wing study. My voice carried a level, unshakable resonance that completely stripped away her illusions of power. "Come inside, Brianna," I said softly. What my daughter was demonstrating was the clinical trap of cruel normalization. In her world of high-end commercial asset management, everything is an object to be optimized, upgraded, or discarded when its utility drops below the corporate profit margin. Brianna had normalized cruelty by hiding it behind professional vocabulary, like asset optimization and strategic family solutions. She unfolded the corporate block buying contracts onto the dark wood table with a crisp, dry snap. Her movements were fluid, clinical, and completely automated, displaying an absolute lack of emotional warmth. She was executing an elder eviction as if it were a routine liquidation report, looking through me as if I were part of the architecture. I know what people often misunderstand when they look at a parent in a situation like this. Audiences get intensely frustrated by a mother's initial passivity. They watch a parent remain silent under a brutal attack and assume it is a sign of weakness, shock, or a total breakdown of will. But they are completely wrong. My 6 months of absolute silence since first discovering her predatory scheme wasn't a sign of elderly compliance. It was the invisible chain of a survivor. I had deliberately built a quiet sanctuary of patience, choosing to give my daughter every single opportunity to return to this home with authenticity, need, and honesty. I chose to wait, tracking her financial decay silently, while the anger inside me burned into something focused and clinical. I needed her to push her predatory behavior to its absolute legal limit before I triggered the reversal. I needed her to sign those contracts, to step completely into the open, and to prove exactly who she had become when nobody was offering her a financial shortcut. If I had intervened a month early, she would have simply slipped behind another layer of corporate gaslighting, manipulating her way out of trouble. I needed her to fully commit to her own darkness so that the lesson would strike her soul. The heavy, suffocating air in the room smelled deeply of rain-soaked cedar from the gardens and the fresh, toxic ink filling the pages of her legal papers. It was a stark reminder that the heritage she was trying to liquidate was the very history that gave her life. She stood under the grand shadow of the tall colonial windows, her posture rigid, arrogant, and unyielding. She had absolutely no idea that she was walking directly into a structural trap. Her learned entitlement had made her completely blind to reality, convincing her that a mother's quiet dignity was synonymous with defeat. She truly believed that love was a transactional contract and that mothers existed solely to be used as liquid capital. But inside my head, the balance sheet was already settled. She was about to learn that some assets cannot be leveraged and some boundaries are absolutely unassailable. Instead of backing down, Brianna doubled down on her corporate hostility. She didn't offer an apology. Instead, she pulled out her phone, her manicured fingers tapping the glass with a sharp click that sounded like an execution timer. "Look, Mom, Cody and I don't have time for a sentimental standoff," she said, her voice dropping into a cold, transactional register. "The development block buyers are closing the portfolio, and I've leveraged that old financial power of attorney from your illness last year to sign a binding agreement where this $700,000 liquidation acts as the exact cash injection required to freeze Cody's immediate corporate foreclosure. The corporate escrow accounts close in 14 days, but I need you transitioned to the Shady Pines facility by Monday morning, so the buyers can begin their mandatory structural inspections. You've created a messy variable, and I am here to close the deal, with or without your compliance." I didn't answer a single word. I didn't engage in the emotional theatre she was projecting. I went back to my internal spreadsheet. Anger wasn't loud. It was clinical. She thought she was running a hostile corporate takeover of my life, but she didn't realize she was dealing with a seasoned archivist who understood the unyielding power of a locked record. I rubbed my eyes, trying to summon a single ounce of regret for the boundary I was about to enforce, but there was only absolute clarity. This wasn't a family breakdown. This was an accounting. I quietly turned away from her phone, walked across the floorboards, and unlatched the heavy mahogany doors to Marcus's old study. A man stepped out into the bright morning light. 50-something, wearing an immaculate grey suit, carrying a heavy leather briefcase. It was Jeffrey, Marcus's corporate trust attorney. Brianna's hand froze completely over her phone. The hyper-confident corporate facade she had spent years building began to drain of colour in an instant. The silence in the room became factual, level, and lethal. Jeffrey walked over to the mahogany table, completely ignoring Brianna's defensive posture, and unclasped his briefcase. He placed a massive leather portfolio directly over her asset liquidation contracts with a heavy, final thud. "Good morning, Brianna," Jeffrey said, his voice entirely clear of emotion, sounding exactly like a courtroom verdict. "Your mother asked me to be here today to audit your paperwork, and to inform you that your signed intent to sell agreement is completely worthless." Brianna's mouth opened, but no sound came out. The transactional arrogance evaporated from her eyes as Jeffrey slid the certified documents across the table. "Exactly 6 months ago," Jeffrey continued, tapping the pages with a methodical finger, "this entire estate was legally transferred into an unassailable, irrevocable family trust. Your father initialized the protective architecture right before his passing. Under state property codes, your mother is the sole beneficiary for the duration of her life, holding absolute, non-negotiable veto power over any structural modifications. You have zero legal authority here. The block buying company you contracted with has no claim. Every document you hold is null and void." They weren't shocked by what they'd done to me. They were shocked that I'd stopped playing along. The heavy atmosphere in my living room completely transformed, settled, factual, and anchored in absolute justice. The legal reversal was only the first layer of the reckoning. Jeffrey reached deeper into the leather portfolio and pulled out a secondary, highly confidential file. This was the data compiled by our forensic private investigator, Nicole, a former police detective who spent months tracking the digital footprints of Brianna's lifestyle. He slid a series of corporate bank statements and forensic accounting records across the table, each document exposing the absolute financial ruin my daughter had been desperately trying to hide from the world. Cody's high-stakes venture capital firm hadn't just hit a minor cash flow issue, it had completely collapsed under a staggering debt of $1,050,000. The creditors were already initializing foreclosure procedures on their luxury suburban condo, and their corporate assets were about to be systematically seized. Your late husband, Marcus, saw the architectural flaws in your daughter's character years before his heart condition matured, Jeffrey explained softly, pointing to a handwritten directive attached to the trust certificates. This legal intervention wasn't a sudden act of malice or an emotional punishment. It was the quiet regret of a guardian. Marcus had realized, with agonizing clarity before he passed, that our early financial enabling had trained our only daughter to become a predator. He realized that by shielding her from every minor struggle, we had accidentally stripped her of her moral compass. He used his final months of fading physical strength to consult with Jeffrey, quietly remapping our finances and building an unyielding shield to protect me from the very child we had raised. As I stared at the financial wreckage laid bare on the mahogany table, a chilling situational reality washed over me. I began to map out the contours of a world without Marcus's foresight. It was a terrifying, hollow landscape. Without this irrevocable legal trust, Brianna's predatory scheme would have succeeded flawlessly. She would have corporate block buyers strip the estate, liquidate the $700,000 equity within weeks to cover Cody's toxic venture debts, and leave me abandoned in a cheap, state-subsidized care facility with absolutely zero legal recourse. She was entirely prepared to let her own mother drown, just to float her artificial social status for a few more months. But Jeffrey wasn't finished. He dropped the ultimate kill shot onto the table, a certified forensic land deed that completely dismantled what was left of her corporate vanity. Cody had quietly discovered Brianna's illicit plan to evict me 3 months ago. Out of profound moral shame and pure survival instinct, he had gone behind her back. He quietly structured his separate family land inheritance through Jeffrey, utilizing an old protective clause to place those assets entirely under the management of my trust, safely out of reach from his corporate creditors. Brianna stood completely unmasked, exposed as a reckless actor who was operating in absolute isolation. She hadn't been pushed by her husband, and she wasn't rescuing her marriage. This wasn't a strategic solution. It was pure, unadulterated greed, and she was entirely alone. The absolute peak of dramatic satisfaction arrived with the total collapse of Brianna's corporate facade. Her hands shook violently, her manicured fingers losing their rigid tension as her asset liquidation papers slipped away, scattering across the rug like dry autumn leaves. She didn't look like an elite commercial manager anymore. Her clinical armor was completely gone, her knees buckled, and she sank deeply into the velvet armchair, her face entirely crumpled as the reality of her structural bankruptcy was laid bare. She began to weep, not the clean, performative tears she used to project, but uncleansed, chaotic, and ragged sobs from somewhere deep inside her. The study was filled with the sound of her jagged breathing as she finally looked up at me, her voice reduced to a desperate, broken whisper. "We're going to lose everything, Mom. The condo, the lifestyle, our entire social standing. Cody's venture fund is dead. I don't know how to survive without opposition. Please, you have to help us. Use the trust. Do something to save us from this ruin." I stood over her, looking down at the scattered evidence of her corporate vanity, feeling a profound clarity. What she was experiencing was the power illusion of the empty wallet. Her entire sense of personal authority, her arrogant posture, and the ice-cold detachment she had used to attempt my eviction were never a reflection of actual character. They were leased asset temporary privileges rented with speculative money. Brianna had spent her adult life confusing having material luxury with being a human of actual substance. The exact second that rented capital disappeared, her internal identity ceased to exist, leaving nothing but an empty, terrified shell of a child weeping in a chair. Her compassion had been a resource she overdrafted, but her power was the ultimate overdraft. This wasn't revenge, it was accounting. I didn't offer a quick financial handout. I didn't reach down to soothe her panic. I calmly reached into my archivist bag and pulled out a pre-written document, not a check to cover her debts, but a strict, non-negotiable blueprint for her moral rehabilitation. I slid the single page across the table, covering her useless liquidation papers with absolute precision. I am going to help you, Brianna. I delivered the finisher with a level, unyielding coldness that cut through the room. But you will not receive a single dollar of your father's capital to pay for Cody's speculative venture debts. This isn't a rescue, it's an intervention. You will hand over your luxury keys today. You and Cody will face an honest Chapter 7 bankruptcy, stripping away the fraudulent debt you've used to inflate your vanity. And for the next 90 days, you will step under my roof. You will live in your old bedroom, completely severed from your corporate network, your meetings, and your digital vanity, until you remember the woman of integrity I actually raised. She stared at the document, her mascara smeared across her hands, her illusions of power entirely crushed. She was no longer a predator, she was a broken child who had finally run out of shortcuts. The next 90 days became a profound, quiet dismantling of Brianna's corporate ego. Stripped of her digital devices and the constant noise of speculative markets, she spent her mornings working directly alongside Teresa, our loyal estate keeper. I watched her from the kitchen window, her manicured fingers getting deeply stained with dark southern soil, as she helped prune the sprawling rose bushes Marcus had planted decades ago. In the evenings, I forced her to accompany me to the local community centre. She sat in a plastic chair, face to face with Melissa, a resilient shift worker who managed a completely debt-free, dignified life for 3 children on a modest $48,000 a year. Watching Melissa track every single penny with absolute discipline and pride shattered Brianna's self-centered illusions of struggle. For the first time in her adult life, she saw the massive chasm between true economic hardship and the moral failure of speculative greed. On her final evening under my roof, when I presented her with a conditional $100,000 check earmarked strictly for her nonprofit leadership certification and ethical career restructuring, Brianna looked at the paper with tears in her clear, honest eyes and calmly slid it back across the table. "I can't take it, Mom," she whispered, her voice carrying a deep, authentic warmth I hadn't heard in 15 years. "Cody and I need to earn our own way back from zero. We've initiated our bankruptcy. He's taken a modest bookkeeping role at a local firm for $58,000, and we need to prove to ourselves that our integrity is worth more than a quick financial rescue." 1 year later, I sat on the stone bench of the Savannah Park, where Marcus had proposed to me 43 years ago, watching the golden afternoon light filter through the ancient live oaks. Brianna stood just a few yards away, leading an intensive financial recovery workshop for local families who had lost their holdings to predatory commercial debt. She wasn't a corporate executioner anymore. She was an authentic educator, running the Marcus Financial Recovery Foundation, which we initialized with the $1,750,000 trust balance that she had systematically refused to touch for her own personal luxury. She had finally learned to measure her worth in human impact rather than commercial capital. I've come to realize that true maternal love is never measured by the size of the financial safety net you place under a child's moral compromises. It is defined by the absolute courage to say no when their soul is on the line. Most parents mistake enabling for protection, constantly writing checks to shield their adult children from the natural consequences of their greed, completely blind to the fact that they are financing their human destruction. When you choose the justice of the sower over cheap, destructive personal revenge, you recognize that family is defined by shared integrity, not shared DNA. Cutting ties with corporate entitlement isn't an act of cruelty. It is an act of absolute moral preservation. Forgiveness isn't always for the other person. Sometimes it's the only way to set yourself free. If you find yourself in a similar situation, looking at a loved one who evaluates your heart as a commercial resource to be cashed out, remember to find the unyielding strength to stand your ground. Let them fall, withhold the rescue, and trust the rock bottom to perform the heavy work that your soft enabling never could. If this architecture of tough love, boundaries, and emotional reconstruction speaks louder than basic internet hate, hit that share button right now. Drop a comment detailing your own journey with family boundaries, subscribe to our channel for more master-level narrative designs, and always remember the most absolute justice doesn't need to scream, it simply outlives the storm. With absolute love and respect,